Incredibly, Alireza Firouzja has not played a classical game of chess in over 5 months. So he returns this week in Bucharest, Romania. He's playing in the Grand Chess Tour, and to get hyped for that event, I'm looking back at classical games he's played against the other participants. So this one was played against Richard Rapport, the super strong Hungarian Grandmaster. It's taken from Norway Chess 2021. Now they played each other twice. In the white game, Alireza destroyed Richard, played a beautiful exchange sacking a Sicilian. I covered that one, I'll link it at the end. In this one, Richard had white, Alireza black. Let's see what happened here. So Richard kicked off with pawn to d4. Alireza went knight f6, and after c4, pawn g6, we had knight c3, and then Alireza went for a Grunfeld here. He loved to play the King's Indian in his youth, but here he goes for the Grunfeld, something different. We had knight f3, bishop g7, now a captures on d5, the knight recaptured, and now Rapport didn't play the standard e4 move. Then we would have had captures on c3, pawn recaptures. This is the main line, very different pawn structure, different themes, black strikes with c5, that kind of thing. But what Rapport does was go for a sideline here with bishop to d2. And now the immediate c5 is a very playable move, and this is preferred by Peter Svidler. He mentioned this one. Now after rook c1, you could have a captures like this. And I show this line because in this line, black actually achieves that capture on d4. They get rid of that c7 pawn, something like this, bishop d7, preparing knight c6. The game's fairly balanced. But Alireza didn't play this immediate c5. Now maybe he wasn't so familiar, or maybe he just wanted to mix up the position. He went castles instead. He delays that move, but it is now a strategic battle. Can black achieve this c7, c5 move and liberate that pawn, or will it become a target? So now we had rook c1 from Rapport, the knight took on c3, the bishop recaptured, and the knight came to d7, preparing c5 in the future, pawn e3, and now Alireza goes b6, preparing to fianchetto his bishop, also supports c5 in future, bishop e2 played. And now you can go c5 here once again, but Alireza prefers to just develop his pieces, but now Rapport gets b4, clamps on that square. It's a bit more difficult, and so Alireza goes knight to f6 here. He abandons that c5 plan for a moment. He's looking to bring it into e4. Now we had castles from white. The knight came to e4. Bishop a1, and now once again Rapport expected pawn to c5 here. There was obviously something Alireza didn't love so much about it. He was worried about the resulting pawn structures, so he just went queen to d6 instead, attacking that b4 pawn. But an excellent response from Rapport. He just went knight to e5, ignoring this one, because if black takes, white takes here. Alireza obviously didn't like that invasion to his 7th rank. So he didn't capture on b4, instead he went rook f to c8, guarding that pawn, and now queen a4 from Rapport. He guards b4, improves his queen, and now really if you're going to liberate with c5, this is the final moment. But probably Alireza didn't like d captures on c5 here, because after pawn recaptures, white can go rook f to d1, you're invading to d7. Now black can kind of survive here with some very careful steps, but it's pretty scary. I can understand why he didn't now do c5, but after he doesn't play that, he goes pawn a6. Now Rapport gets to land a knight on c6, and black's got some long-term difficulties with this backwards pawn. So b5 was played by Alireza. He cuts the communication of the queen. So it jumps back to c2 here, and now the knight is very difficult to live with on that square. There's also an attack on your knight, so the bishop chopped here, the queen recaptured, these ones came off, and now Alireza goes a5. He gets rid of this bad pawn, he wants to open up the a file for his rook, and if white takes here too hastily, then black can take and is actually doing fine. You've opened up the rook, equalised the position. So Rapport correctly didn't take, he hits that knight, and I think knight d6 here was slightly more precise, holds b5 for the moment, although white can go bishop to c3, maintain an advantage. Alireza went knight to f6 instead, and now the bishop took on b5. Yes, this one took on b4, but then bishop c4 played. Holds that a2 pawn, and white's just a bit better here, as we can see. Rapport's got the bishop pair, also pressure coming down the c-file, not so easy for black now. So knight e4 from Alireza, he hops back, he's looking at d2. Rook to c1 played, knight d2 anyway, and now the bishop came to a6, it attacks that rook, so it came to the b file here, and now you can't pick up the pawn immediately, you lose your bishop here, so this one nudged up the board, attacking the knight, and knight e4 was playable, but I think Alireza just didn't like what Rapport can now do to slowly build the pressure, maybe drop that bishop back, there's still pressure against this pawn long term, so what Alireza did instead was play this rook to b6 move. So his whole idea is that after white trades, which was played, pawn recaptures, well now if white takes the knight, black takes the bishop, and so for the sake of those double pawns, Alireza's just mixed up the position a bit, opened the a file, he loves these tactical opportunities. So bishop to b7 was played by Rapport, excellent move. The rook came into a7, the bishop now came to c6, and now the knight's genuinely attacked, so the knight came back to b1 here, it's heading for this c3 square. So bishop d5 was played, holds this pawn, hits a wonderful diagonal, the knight came to c3, and now you could take this one of course, be a pawn up, but the super GMs, they love their bishops, you don't want to go just giving this one away, plus then you've got these opposite colored bishop endgames, maybe it could be drawish, so Rapport would prefer to hold the pressure, keep his dark squared bishop, he just plays bishop to b3 here. And now Alireza really had to play pawn to e5. That's the best move in the position here. It opens up the g7 bishop, puts a bit of pressure on. White still remains better, but it was the best move on the board because after rook to c7, Rapport's very quick to go pawn f4, shut down any possibility of that in future, and now he can just very slowly improve the position. So e6 from Alireza. So now if you go a3 as white, preparing to undermine this pawn, then try and win the knight on c3, well this bishop can always drop back, defend the pawn, we'll see those themes in a moment. Now g4 was played by Rapport first, he just improved some pieces first before he goes pawn a3. So bishop f6 from Alireza, pawn g5, bishop e7, the king came to g2, Alireza improves his, king f3, pawn h6, pawn h4 from Rapport, just such a pleasant position for white now. The rook came to c8, so some shuffling from Alireza, bishop b2, pawn b5, and after rook c1, bishop d8, now Rapport finally goes pawn a3. You can't capture that one of course, or you lose your knight here with bishop takes on c3. So we had the bishop bouncing round here, and now the pawn captured here, the bishop recaptured, and pawn e4. So Rapport's generating this passed pawn. This is the big problem now. That bishop pair, that pawn structure that was better, it's leading to a passed pawn. Big problems now for black. So bishop a5 from Alireza. He clears the way for the pawn. Pawn d5 from Rapport. The pawn captured, a recaptures here. We had this trade on the king side, and now pawn b4 cements that knight, but pawn d6 from Rapport. And look at those bishops lasering down the board, beautiful position, and after rook to d8 attacking the pawn, the dark squared bishop immediately comes into its own because rook d1 defends, you can't take this one, it's pinned to the king here. And now you might wonder why black didn't go rook to d7, well now rook d4 can be played. It attacks this pawn, this bishop's now a terrible piece tied down to the defence, so you could never go bishop b6 now for example, attacking the rook, so it's just a very miserable position, plus one day white might bounce this light squared bishop in, attack the rook at the right moment if you eliminated this knight, just many different themes that make this unpleasant for black. So Alireza went bishop b6, it stops rook d4, but it did allow pawn d7, king f8 was now played, rook d6 invaded, And you might wonder why Alireza didn't go bishop to c7. This was definitely playable, but white can actually just drop back, rook d3. And king e7 looks so obvious, of course, but you're never really threatening to win that pawn. I mean, say white waits with bishop to c1. You could also go, say, king g4 there. Well, if you capture this one, if you ever have a line like this, well, then white's picking up here. You're gobbling these pawns. This is a technically lost endgame. So that's why that pawn's immune, really. Alireza instead, in this position, played bishop to a7. We now had bishop c4, just micro improvements. Bishop c5 from Alireza. Rook c6 now picked up a tempo, and after it came into d4, rook c8 was played. So now black's in big trouble, and the best move here with the time ticking down would have been bishop to b6, but Alireza was low on the clock. He went king to e7, but this fails to a simple tactical move. And if you've enjoyed this video, do let me know by hitting that like button and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. So here Rapport played bishop takes on f7, decoying that king away, because if you capture the bishop, then you lose your rook here. And equally, if you try and take the rook, well, then white's making a queen. So none of that's working. Rapport took on d7, but now simply the rook dropped back, hits this bishop. The king attacked this bishop here, but now the bishop took on g6. Rook d6 was played, hitting the bishop, but this was the final move of the game. Takes on b4. Black can't even win the light squared bishop, or you lose your own dark squared, and these two connected passes will be winning the game. So a great game by Rapport. He outfoxed Firouzja in the opening and then slowly applied the pressure. If you want to see their other game from this tournament, then click here. Thanks for watching, see you soon.